Settle into wherever you are right now. Not the version of yourself you are trying to become, not the version you were before things got complicated, just the one who is here, breathing, in this body, on this particular day. Let whatever tension you are holding in your shoulders drop an inch. Let your jaw unclench if it has been clenching. Let your hands rest open rather than closed, palms up. The small gesture of a person who is, for this hour at least, not trying to hold anything together. You do not have to be anywhere other than where you are. You do not have to have resolved anything. You do not have to know what comes next. In this hour, the only requirement is the one you are already meeting. You are here, and you are listening. And that is the whole of what is asked. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching after his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. He taught kings and farmers, scholars and thieves, the very young and the very old. He taught people who came to him in grief, in confusion, in desperation, in anger, in the exhausted state that arrives when a person has tried everything they know how to try and finds themselves no further forward than when they began. He never turned anyone away. He never told anyone their question was the wrong question. He simply looked at what was actually present, in the person in front of him, in the situation they described, and responded to what was real rather than to what he expected. What strikes students of the tradition again and again, across all the centuries and all the translations, is how practical his teaching was. Not practical in the sense of giving people strategies or techniques or 5 steps to a better life, but practical in the deepest sense, grounded in the actual texture of human experience, attentive to what suffering actually feels like from the inside, and consistently pointing back to something that was always already available, a quality of awareness and clarity that did not require special conditions to be present, only the willingness to look honestly at what was there. Today's story is about that kind of looking. It is the story of a man named David, 51 years old, an architect, someone who had spent his entire adult life building things with great intention and considerable skill, and who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in February at the unsettling realization that he had no idea what he was building toward. Not his career, his life. He could describe everything he had done. He could not say what any of it had been for. This is a story about the question that arrives in the middle years of a life, often quietly, always inconveniently, when the accomplishments that were supposed to feel like enough reveal themselves as still somehow insufficient, when the life that was carefully constructed according to the right blueprints turns out to have rooms in it that were never furnished, when the person who has been very busy for a very long time sits down for a moment and becomes aware of a silence inside the busyness that has apparently been there all along, waiting. It is also a story about a river, a conversation with a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger in any way that mattered, and about the Buddhist teaching on upadana, attachment, clinging, the particular way we grasp at the experiences and identities and futures we have decided are necessary for our life to be worthwhile, and what becomes possible in the moment we begin, even tentatively, to loosen the grip. David had grown up in a family that understood ambition as a form of love. His father was an engineer who worked long hours and expressed his devotion to his family through the quality of what he provided: the good school, the reliable car, the house in the right neighborhood. His mother was a woman of considerable intelligence, who had directed most of that intelligence toward the project of her children's futures, tracking David's and his sister's academic performance with the same meticulous attention a gardener brings to the cultivation of something valuable and fragile. The message was never spoken explicitly, because in families like his, it never needed to be. What you achieved was what you were, and what you were needed to be something worthy of the effort that had gone into producing you. David had absorbed this message early and completely. He was a good student, then an excellent one. He went to a well-regarded architecture school and graduated near the top of his class. He joined a firm with a strong reputation, worked with the focused intensity of someone who had something to prove, and proved it. By his late 30s, he was a partner. By his mid-40s, he had his own firm, a modest but respected practice, with a particular interest in residential work. Houses that were carefully made and thoughtfully designed and built to last. He was good at his work. He knew he was good at his work. He had the external markers, the awards, the clients who came back, the younger architects who wanted to work with him, to confirm what he already knew. His marriage to a woman named Sarah had been, for most of its 23 years, a genuinely good one. Not perfect, not without its difficult periods, but fundamentally sound, built on a real friendship and a shared set of values, and the particular kind of intimacy that accumulates between two people who have raised a child together and weathered the ordinary disasters that a life of 23 years inevitably contains. Their son, now grown and living in another city, had turned out well, a word David used frequently, and then one day noticed was a strange word to use about a person, as though his son's primary function had been to turn out, rather than to simply be. That Tuesday in February, David was sitting at his drafting table. He still used a drafting table, one of the few architects of his generation who had not entirely surrendered the physical act of drawing to the screen, looking at plans for a house he was designing for a couple he liked and respected. The house was good. He knew it was good. He had solved several interesting structural problems with solutions he was quietly pleased with, and the clients were going to be happy. He was looking at the plans and thinking none of these thoughts consciously. He was simply looking at the plans, and then he was not looking at the plans, but at the table, and then he was not looking at the table, but at some middle distance that was not quite the wall and not quite anything else. And in that middle distance, he found the question that had apparently been waiting there for some time. What is this for? Not the house. The house was for the clients. Not the firm. The firm was for many things, for the work itself, for the people who worked in it, for the community of projects and relationships and ideas that constituted his professional life and which he genuinely valued. Those answers were available and true. The question that was waiting in the middle distance was not about any of those things. It was about the larger structure, the whole of it. The accumulated enterprise of a life now more than half over, built with great care and considerable intelligence, and a quality of intentionality that had never once paused to ask, with any real depth or honesty, what is the point of all this? He did not call it a midlife crisis. He was 51, and he had always found that phrase slightly contemptible in the way that names for things can make the things seem smaller than they are. What he recognized in the question, sitting at his drafting table on a Tuesday afternoon in February, with the plans for a good house spread in front of him, was not crisis, but clarity. A sudden, unwelcome, impossible to unfeel clarity about something that had been true for a long time, and that he had been, without knowing it, too busy to see. He closed the plans. He put on his coat. He left the office, something he almost never did in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and walked to the river that ran through the edge of the city, a river he had designed around on several projects, but had almost never simply walked beside. The day was cold and gray, and the river was moving fast with the recent rain. He stood on the path and watched the water. He was standing there, not doing anything, not resolving anything, just standing, when a man settled onto the bench nearby. The man was perhaps 65, with a quality of settled stillness that David noticed immediately and could not quite name. He was not meditating, or appeared not to be. His eyes were open, watching the river with an unhurried attention that suggested this was a normal thing for him, this quality of simply being in a place without needing the place to produce anything. They did not speak for several minutes. Then the man said, without preamble, as though they were continuing a conversation already in progress, "It is a very good river for this." David looked at him. "For what?" he said. "For whatever brought you here in the middle of a Tuesday," the man said. He said it without judgment, with a faint smile, and David found that he was not offended. He said, "I don't know what brought me here. I left my office and I walked, and this is where I ended up." The man nodded. "That is often how it works," he said. "The body knows before the mind catches up." They sat in silence for a moment. Then the man asked, simply and directly, "What is it that you are holding on to?" It was an odd question. David looked at the man more carefully. He was wearing ordinary clothes, nothing remarkable, and his face had the particular quality of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by anything. Not jaded, the opposite of jaded. someone who has made a full peace with the unpredictability of things, and now simply meets whatever arrives without the armor of expectation. David said, "I don't know what you mean." The man said, "You look like a man who has built something very carefully and is only now beginning to wonder whether the building was the point." That is usually a question about holding on, about what we are afraid to let go of. David did not ask how the man could see this from a park bench on a Tuesday afternoon. He simply sat with it because it was precise, and when something is precise, you do not need to verify it. You simply recognize it. He said, "I have spent 30 years building a career, a firm, a reputation, a marriage, a family, a life that looks exactly like what I thought I wanted." The man waited. David said, "And sitting at my desk today, I realized I have no idea what I was building it toward. I thought the building was the point. I thought when you had built enough, when you had enough of the right things, you would feel, I don't know, complete, finished, like you had arrived somewhere." The man nodded slowly. He said, "The Buddha describes something very like what you are experiencing. He called it the hunger that eats itself. The way we pursue things under the belief that possessing them will bring the satisfaction we are looking for, and then discover, upon possessing them, that the satisfaction is either absent or briefer than expected, and the hunger is still there, now redirected toward the next thing." He said that this is not a flaw in the particular things we pursue. It is the nature of pursuing. The suffering is not in what we want. It is in the wanting itself, or more precisely, in the quality of grasping that underlies the wanting. The conviction that without this particular thing, this particular outcome, this particular version of our life, we cannot be whole. David looked at the river. He said, "So what is the alternative? To want nothing? To stop caring about what you do or whether it matters?" The man shook his head. He said, "No, that is a misunderstanding of the teaching that people make often, because it seems to follow logically from the diagnosis. If wanting is the problem, then not wanting must be the solution." But the Buddha was not teaching indifference. He was teaching a different quality of engagement. You can care deeply about your work without gripping it. You can love your family without clinging to your idea of what they should be. You can build with full attention and full commitment without making the outcome of the building the condition of your peace. The Buddhist word is upadana, usually translated as clinging or attachment. What it actually points to is the specific way we make our experience of well-being conditional on things being a particular way. When I have enough, when I have built enough, when the people I love are okay, when the life I am living matches the image of the life I am supposed to be living. That conditionality is the source of the restlessness, not the caring itself. David sat with this. He was an architect. He was accustomed to structural problems, to finding the fault in a design and understanding how to address it. He recognized what the man was describing not as a spiritual abstraction, but as a structural issue in the design of his experience. He had built his sense of well-being on a foundation of conditionality. When this happens, then I will be satisfied. When I have achieved this, then it will be enough. The foundation was, by design, never stable, because the conditions were never fully met, and when they were met, the goalpost moved. He said, "How do you change something like that? It is not like changing a habit. It is more like changing the way you perceive." The man said, "Yes, that is exactly what it is." The Buddha did not offer techniques for rearranging the contents of a life. He offered a way of seeing that once genuinely adopted, changes the relationship to the contents rather than the contents themselves. The house is the same house. The work is the same work. The people you love are the same people. What changes is the quality of grip you bring to them. Whether you hold them as conditions for your peace or as gifts that are present now and may not always be. Whether you meet your life as something that must continually earn your engagement, or as something that is already, in this moment, sufficient to engage with fully. He paused. Then he said, "There is a teaching in the tradition that goes like this. A student came to a master and said, 'I have been practicing for many years and I am still suffering. What am I doing wrong?' The master said, "What are you holding?" The student said, "Nothing." The master said, "Then let it go." David looked at the man. He said, "The student wasn't holding nothing." The man smiled. He said, "No, the student was holding the idea of themselves as someone who was holding nothing, which is perhaps the most tenacious thing of all to hold." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The river moved, the gray light shifted. David felt something happening in his chest that he could not have named precisely, but that had the quality of space. Not emptiness, but openness. A quality of room where there had been, he now realized, a very long and persistent tightness. He said, "I think I have been holding the idea of myself as someone who has it figured out. Someone who built the right life and made the right choices and arrived at a point where the account balances. And the account does not balance. And I don't know what to do with that." The man said, "You do not have to do anything with it. The recognition is the thing. Most people spend their whole lives defending the account rather than looking at it honestly. The fact that you have looked at it, that you are sitting on this bench on a Tuesday afternoon looking at it instead of going back to the office, that is already the beginning of something." David said, "The beginning of what?" The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Of living your life instead of managing it." They talked for a while longer. Or rather, David talked and the man listened with the same quality of unhurried attention he had brought to watching the river, and occasionally said something that cut through to what David was actually trying to say, with a precision that he found simultaneously disorienting and relieving, the way it is relieving to be seen clearly by someone who does not have an investment in what they see. At some point, the man stood, said it had been a pleasure, and walked away along the river path. David did not get his name. He did not ask. It seemed, in the moment, beside the point. He sat on the bench alone for a while after, watching the water. The river did not care about the account. The river simply moved, with all its accumulated force and history, from one place to another, fully present in each moment of its passage, not trying to arrive anywhere, not worried about what it would find when it got there. He thought about what the man had said. Living your life instead of managing it. He had been managing. He understood that now. The careful construction, the strategic choices, the continuous calibration of outcomes against expectations, all of it had been management. The work of someone who was running a project called his life, rather than inhabiting it. And somewhere in the process of managing it so diligently, he had lost contact with the thing he was managing. The actual texture of his days, the quality of his attention in any given moment. The simple presence of being here, in this place, with these people, doing this work. He thought about Sarah. He thought about how often in the last years he had been in the same room with her, while being, in the way that actually mattered, entirely elsewhere. In the project, in the problem, in the plan. He thought about how rarely he had simply looked at her the way he was now looking at the river, with no agenda, no analysis, no sense of what the looking was supposed to produce. He thought about his son and all the visits that had passed in the mode of checking rather than being. Checking in on how he was doing, whether he was on track, whether the trajectory of his life was acceptable, whether the account of his parenting had produced the intended outcome. He thought about how little he had simply sat with his son, the way the man on the bench had simply sat with the river. He took out his phone. He called Sarah. When she answered, he said, "I am sitting by the river. I left the office. I have been thinking about some things, and I wanted to hear your voice." She said, "Is everything okay?" He said, "Yes. I think things might actually be okay. I'm not sure things have been okay for a while, but I think they are now. Can I tell you about it when I get home?" She said, "Of course." He sat for a while longer. Then he walked home. Over the following months, David did what people do when something real has shifted in them. He followed it. He found the Buddhist center in the university district that the man on the bench had mentioned, almost in passing, almost as if it were a coincidence that he had mentioned it at all. He attended a series of introductory evenings on the teachings, sitting in the back, listening with the careful attention of a person accustomed to understanding structural things, and finding that the structural thing being described, the architecture of suffering, the specific way that clinging to conditioned outcomes creates a life that is always reaching rather than arriving, mapped precisely onto the experience he had been carrying without knowing it. He did not become a different person. He did not leave his firm or his marriage or his professional life. He continued to design houses, continued to solve the structural problems that gave him genuine satisfaction, continued to build things. But something in the quality of the building changed. He was less invested in the outcome as a verdict on his worth, more present to the work itself, more attentive to the people in the rooms he was designing, not just to what they needed from a house, but to the quality of life they were trying to create inside it, the specific texture of what they hoped the space would hold. He began to have conversations with Sarah that had a different quality from the conversations they had been having for perhaps the last decade. Conversations that did not begin with an agenda, that were not primarily about logistics or planning or the management of their shared life, but that were simply two people who had known each other for a long time, talking about what was actually on their minds, which turned out to be considerably more than either of them had known. He called his son more often and differently, not checking, just present, the way the man had been present on the bench. He still had difficult days. He still caught himself in the grip of the old pattern, the conditional approach, the sense that the account needed to balance before he could be at ease. But he caught it more quickly now, and when he caught it, he had something to do with it. Not a technique exactly, more like a question he had learned to ask himself, a question that the man on the bench had given him, without quite framing it as a question. What are you holding? And then, can you let it go? The answers varied. Sometimes he could. Sometimes the holding was more tenacious than he expected. But the asking of the question was itself a kind of practice, a small recurring act of honesty with himself that kept the awareness alive, that prevented the managing from becoming so seamless again that he lost sight of what was underneath it. He went back to the river often. He never saw the man again. He was not certain in the reflective part of himself that the encounter had been quite what it appeared to be, whether the man had been an ordinary stranger or something else, something that the rational part of him had no good framework for, and that the part of him that had been quietly opening since that February Tuesday was more comfortable leaving unanswered. He had asked a Buddhist teacher about this once, obliquely, describing the encounter without asking about it directly, and the teacher had said only, the teaching arrives in the form it needs to arrive in. Sometimes it is a book. Sometimes it is a silence. Sometimes it is a stranger on a bench by a river who knows how to ask the right question. David thought about the house he had been designing when all of this began, the one whose plans he had left on the drafting table when he walked out of his office on that Tuesday. The house was built now. The clients had moved in. He had visited once, a few months after the completion, the way he always visited his finished buildings, to see how they were sitting in their light, how the spaces were working. The couple had filled the rooms in ways he had not anticipated, and that he found now more interesting than if they had filled them as he had imagined. The light in the main room fell differently in the afternoon than it had on the drawings, and differently again from what it had been during construction. A quality of light that was its own thing, produced by the specific combination of glass and wall and the angle of this particular site in relation to this particular sky, and which would change again in winter and again in spring, and which could never have been entirely predicted, only made possible by the choices that had been made carefully along the way. He stood in the room for a while, watching the light. The building was not what he had designed. It was what had grown from what he had designed, shaped by all the things that had happened between the drawing and the inhabiting, by the choices of the people who lived in it, by the weather and the seasons and the particular quality of afternoon in that place. It was better than what he had designed, in the way that things that are alive are better than their blueprints. Not in spite of being unpredictable, but because of it. He thought about what the man had said by the river, living your life instead of managing it. He thought about what it would mean to design not just buildings, but a life, on the understanding that the best outcome could not be fully controlled, only prepared for, that the quality of what you ended up with depended less on getting everything right in advance and more on being present enough to recognize what the light was doing when it arrived. He thought about the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, not managing his enlightenment, but simply sitting, fully present, fully open, not trying to make anything happen, only willing to see with complete honesty whatever arose. And what arose in that quality of complete presence and complete honesty was not a technique or a strategy or a plan. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that does not require anything to be different from what it is. The kind that is available now, in this light, in this room, in this life, to anyone who is willing to stop managing long enough to simply look. This is what the teachings offer. Not a better version of the life you are already trying to manage. Not the completion of the account, the arrival at the place where you finally feel that you have enough and are enough, and that the ledger has at last balanced in your favor. The teachings offer something harder and simpler and more immediately available than any of that. They offer the possibility of meeting your life, this life, the one you are already living, with all its unresolved questions and incomplete accounts and rooms that were never furnished in the way you planned, with the quality of attention you would bring to a river on a cold afternoon, watching it simply because it is there, because it is moving, because it is real. You have spent a great deal of your life building. The building has mattered. The work has been real. The love has been real. The effort has been real. But the building was never the point. The point was always the life that was happening while you were building. The conversations you were almost present for. The light that was falling in rooms you were moving through too quickly to notice. The people who were there, fully there, in the same space as a version of you that was already in the next room, the next project, the next condition that would finally, once met, allow you to arrive. You can arrive now. Not at the end of anything, not at the completion of anything, but simply here, in this moment, which contains everything that this moment contains. The weight of everything you have carried, and the possibility of setting some of it down, and the awareness, if you are willing to be still long enough to feel it, that something in you was never burdened by any of it. Something that was watching all along, with the same unhurried attention as a man on a bench by a river. Something that did not need the account to balance before it could be at peace. That something is not something you have to find. It has been here the whole time. It is here now. It is the awareness in which this story has been heard, in which this breath is occurring, in which the managing and the building and the questioning and the occasional quiet arrival have all been taking place. It was never elsewhere. It was never absent. It was simply waiting, the way the river waits, which is to say, not waiting at all, simply present, continuously, in the only moment there is. Rest here now. In this breath, in this body, in this life that is already, if you can be still enough to feel it, completely sufficient for the simple and extraordinary act of being alive in it. The account is not what matters. What matters is the light. And the light is here. It has always been here. May you find in the middle of your life, wherever the middle is, whenever it arrives, not crisis, but clarity. May the question that comes quietly in the afternoon not frighten you away from the bench, but invite you to sit down on it and watch the river. May the things you have been holding loosen their grip, not because you have forced them open, but because you have finally become willing to ask what they are costing you to carry. May your life be less managed and more inhabited. May the rooms you have built for yourself be full of the light that comes from actually being in them. And may you know, as the evening settles and the day comes to its natural close, that you did not miss it, that you were here, that the life was real and the love was real and the effort was real, and the awareness in which all of it occurred was never, not for a single moment, anything other than whole. You were always already home. Rest in that. There is one more thread worth following before we close today. The teaching on upadana, on clinging, on the way we make our peace conditional on things being a particular way, is sometimes misunderstood as a teaching about detachment in the cold sense, about not caring, about moving through the world with a kind of spiritual remove that insulates you from the full impact of what happens. This is a misreading, and it is worth correcting, because the misreading leads people away from the teaching rather than toward it. The Buddha was not a man of cold remove. Everything recorded in the tradition about his presence with other people suggests the opposite, someone who was fully, warmly, unhurriedly present with whatever and whoever was in front of him. He wept when his close friend and attendant, Ananda, was in distress. He sat with dying people. He received the grief of bereaved parents with the same quality of complete attention he brought to questions of metaphysics. He was not above the emotional texture of human experience. He was fully in it. What he had, what the teachings point toward, was not the absence of feeling, but the absence of being controlled by feeling. The capacity to be fully affected by what happens without being destabilized by it, to feel the loss without being swept away by it, to feel the joy without gripping it until it bruises, to be present in the full range of human experience, without needing any particular part of it to be other than it is. This is what David was beginning to learn, sitting in his rooms with Sarah and hearing her more clearly than he had in years, not because he no longer cared, but because he had begun to care differently, with less agenda, with less of the conditional quality that had been present for so long he had ceased to notice it. He cared about Sarah the person, not Sarah the component of the life he was managing. He was present with her, not with the version of the conversation he was planning while she was still speaking. This distinction between caring that grasps and caring that opens is the whole of what the Buddha was pointing at when he taught about love. Metta, which we translate as loving kindness, is not a soft or sentimental thing. It is a rigorous thing. It is the practice of wishing well-being to another person, genuinely, without condition, without wanting anything from them in return, without making your goodwill contingent on their behavior or their gratitude, or whether they respond the way you hoped. It is perhaps the most demanding practice in the tradition, not because it requires great effort, but because it requires the one thing that is hardest for most people to sustain: complete, unconditional presence with another person's reality, without making it about your own. David did not become a master of this. He was 51 and he had been relating to people conditionally for 30 years, and the habits of 30 years did not dissolve in a few months of sitting and listening and walking beside a river. But he was learning the shape of it. He was learning what it felt like when he was present in the opening sense, and what it felt like when he was present in the grasping sense, and the ability to tell the difference, which is not a skill you have, but a sensitivity you develop, through practice, through failure, through the willingness to keep returning, was itself already a kind of freedom. He thought sometimes about the man on the bench, about the quality of attention he had brought to the river, and then, without anything changing, brought to David. He thought about how it had felt to be on the receiving end of that quality of attention, genuinely seen, not assessed, not managed, simply met. He thought about how rarely he had offered that to the people in his life, how much of his attention had been conditional, allocated, rationed according to what he needed from the interaction. How different it might have been, for Sarah and for his son, and for the younger architects who worked in his firm, if he had known how to simply show up the way the man had shown up, without agenda, without management, with nothing required of the moment except the willingness to be fully in it. He was learning. He was 51, and he was learning something that some people learn in their 20s, and some people never learn at all, and some people learn at the end, when there is less time, but also perhaps more clarity about what the time is for. He thought that was acceptable. He thought that the timing of a genuine understanding is less important than the depth of it, and that a thing understood fully at 51 was more valuable than a thing known superficially at 25. The river was still there when he went to walk beside it. The water still moved with the same unhurried authority. He had walked beside it through one winter now and one spring and into the summer, and he had watched it change with the seasons, running fast and dark in the winter rain, quieter and greener in the summer, and it had never once failed to return him to the same quality of presence he had found on the bench that first Tuesday afternoon. He thought about what the teacher at the Buddhist Center had said about the three jewels of the tradition: the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. The teacher, the teaching, the community of practice. He had found all three in unexpected forms. The teacher briefly on a bench. The teaching gradually in books and evening sittings, and the slow work of paying attention to his own experience with a little more honesty than before. And the community, which was not the formal community of the meditation center, though he valued that, but the informal one he had been part of all along and had not known how to inhabit. Sarah and his son, and the people who worked in his firm and trusted him with something real every day, and the clients who came to him with the hope of something that mattered, and the houses themselves, the ones he had built and the ones he was building, each of them a form of conversation with the people who would live in them, a question asked in stone and glass and light. What does a life need to hold itself well? He was still asking that question. He thought he would always be asking it. He had come to believe over the months of practice and attention and the gradual loosening of the grip that the question was not a problem to be solved, but an orientation to be maintained, a way of approaching the work and the days and the people with an open hand rather than a closed one, with the quality of someone who is building towards something but is not so invested in the outcome that they miss what the building itself contains. The light is always doing something. In the rooms he designed and in the days he inhabited, and in the moments of genuine presence he was, slowly and imperfectly, learning to let in. The light is always doing something. You only have to stop managing long enough to see it. That is what the teaching offers. That is what David found on a bench by a river on an ordinary Tuesday in February, when he walked out of his life for an afternoon and discovered that his life was there to walk back into, richer, stranger, more actual than the version he had been so carefully managing. If you are someone who has been managing your life rather than living it, if the account has been more important than the light, if the question has arrived inconveniently and irreversibly in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, you do not have to answer it today. You only have to be willing to sit with it, to go to the river or whatever your river is, and watch the water for a while without needing it to be anything other than what it is. The question is not an emergency. It is an invitation. You have time. You have this breath. You have this moment. You have the awareness in which both are occurring, which is the same awareness that has been here through all the managing and all the building and all the years of trying to make the account balance, and which has never once been anything other than quietly, patiently, completely here. Stop for a moment. Stop just long enough to feel that. You are not behind. You have not missed it. The life is still going on right now, and you are in it, and the light is doing something, and you can see it if you look. Living your life instead of managing it. That is all the Buddha was ever pointing at. It is available now. It has always been available now. May you find it, not at the end of anything, not when the conditions are finally right, but here, in this breath, in this body, in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being alive and awake and present in the only moment there is. The account can wait. The light will not. There is something the Buddhist tradition offers that most modern approaches to anger do not, and it is worth sitting with before we close. Most of what we understand about managing anger, the psychological frameworks, the therapeutic tools, the self-help vocabulary, operates on the assumption that anger is a problem to be solved, a malfunction to be corrected. An emotion that is, by its nature, something to be gotten past, worked through, and eventually eliminated, so that the undisturbed self can emerge on the other side. The goal in most of these frameworks is the absence of anger, the state in which the thing that made you angry no longer has the power to activate you. The Buddhist teaching is subtler than this, and ultimately more useful for people who are carrying anger that is old and deep and has legitimate roots in real harm. The Buddha did not teach that anger was wrong. He did not teach that the experience of anger was evidence of spiritual failure. What he taught, with a precision that has survived 25 centuries precisely because it maps so accurately onto what human beings actually experience, was that there are two distinct things happening when we are in the grip of sustained anger or resentment. The first is the original wound, the harm that was done, the injustice, the loss. That is real. It happened. It deserves to be acknowledged, named, felt, and honored as real. To minimize it or rush past it in the name of spiritual practice is its own form of harm. The second thing is the story, the narrative constructed around the wound, the file, to use David's word, the rehearsed arguments, the accumulated evidence, the vision of how things should have gone, the ongoing maintenance of an account in which someone is perpetually in debt to you. This second thing, the story, is not the wound. It is what the wound becomes when it is neither grieved nor released, but simply sustained. And it is the story, not the wound itself, that does the ongoing damage. The wound is a thing that happened. The story is something we keep making happen every time we open the file. The practice the Buddha offered is not the elimination of anger, but the cultivation of the kind of awareness that can observe anger without being identical to it. The kind of presence that can say, I am angry. I know what this feels like in my body. I understand what it is responding to. Without immediately becoming the anger. Without the anger becoming the lens through which everything else is seen. This is what the Vipassana practice David undertook was training. Not the suppression of difficult states, but the development of a quality of observing them that is a little wider than the states themselves, a little more spacious, a little less merged. This takes time. It takes practice. It takes the kind of patience that is itself a spiritual quality, a form of trust in the process even when the process is uncomfortable and the results are not yet visible. David did not develop this capacity in 10 days. He was still developing it years later. That is not a failure of the practice. That is the practice. There is a teaching from the Theravada tradition, one of the schools in which the Vipassana practice David undertook has its roots, that speaks to this directly. It describes the mind of the practitioner as being like the hand of a blacksmith. When the blacksmith is a beginner, the iron is stronger than the hand. The metal is hard and unyielding, and the hand is easily hurt. Over time, through regular work, through sustained contact with the material, the relationship changes. The hand becomes capable. Not because the iron has changed. The iron is still iron, but the hand has developed the skill and the strength to work with it. The iron does not have to become something other than iron for the relationship between the hand and the iron to change fundamentally. The anger does not have to disappear for your relationship to it to change fundamentally. The harm that was done does not have to be revised into something smaller or less real for you to stop giving it your entire interior life. The story does not have to be replaced with a better story. It only has to be seen as a story, constructed, maintained, capable of being put down, rather than as the unalterable truth of what you are and what was done to you. This seeing is what practice cultivates. This seeing is what David began to develop on the 6th day of 10 days of silence. This seeing is what his daughter noticed at Christmas dinner before he had any idea that there was something to see. This seeing is available to anyone willing to sit still long enough to look. You do not need a 10-day retreat to begin. David would be the first to say this. He has said it to his son, who asked him about it at 19 in the tentative way of young people asking their parents about things they have noticed but not quite named. You do not need 10 days. You need 10 minutes. You need the willingness to sit with what is there without the usual scaffolding of distraction, and to observe it with the same quality of attention you would bring to something important. Because it is important. What you are carrying is important. Not because the carrying is serving you, It probably is not, or not in the way you need, but because the wound underneath it is real, and real wounds deserve real attention, not the half attention of someone who has decided to move past it by burying it in the maintenance of the account. Sit with what is there. Notice what arises. Name it without judgment. Anger, grief, loss, resentment. The particular texture of this specific wound in this specific body. And then, when you have named it, when you have let it be fully real for a moment, ask the question that David asked on a hilltop on the way home from a countryside retreat in late summer, looking at fields and roads and a river catching the afternoon light. What would it mean to put this down? Not to erase it, not to pretend, not to forgive what has not yet been fully felt. Just to put it down, here, now, in this breath. To see what is on the other side of the weight you have been carrying. The other side is your life. The one that has been happening while you were inside the file. The one with the view from the hilltop and the evening light on the grass, and the kitchen where someone who loves you is making tea, and the children who grew up watching you carry something they could not name, and who, when you begin to set it down, will notice before you tell them. The other side is presence, the particular, irreplaceable quality of being in your own life rather than in the story about your life, of being available to what is actually here rather than what was once there and is now only preserved in the maintenance of your telling of it. It is not too late. Whatever age you are reading this, whatever number of years you have been carrying what you carry, it is not too late. The Buddha did not place a time limit on the practice. The hand can learn to work with the iron at any stage of the blacksmith's life. The only requirement is the willingness to pick up the tools and begin. You already have the tools. You have always had them. They are the same ones you brought into this moment. Your breath, your body, your willingness to sit still and look. These are enough. They have always been enough. And the practice that begins with sitting still and looking is the practice that over time gives you back the interior space that resentment has been occupying. Gives it back not as emptiness, but as availability, as capacity, as the particular quality of presence that David's wife called easier to be with, and his daughter called more here, and which is, underneath both of those descriptions, simply the experience of someone who has put down a weight they were carrying for too long, and discovered that their hands are free. Free for something else, for the work that is here, for the people who are present, for the view that was always there, that does not require the file to close before it can be seen, but that is seen so much more clearly when it is. May you find that clarity. May you find those free hands. May the weight you have been carrying find in time its right place. Not in the center of your life, not as the organizing principle of your interior world, but as part of your history, acknowledged and real, and no longer fed. And may you be, in the fullness of that, more here than you have been in a long time. Rest now. You have done enough for today.